In Indal, there are a great many paintings depicting all manner of hells. But I think real hell might be closer to something like this.
Long ago, too long ago, I used to think like you. Indeed, it led me to climb the world tree. However, I did not find Elysium or the architect. I believe it was because I was unworthy.
Watch humans closely and you'll learn one thing. Deep down, they wish they were dead. They kill each other like they swat flies, running towards oblivion like blind rats. They see the divine flame of life and piss over it. They're genius at that. In a class all of their own, really. Oh, that flame is wasted on them. So I want to give them a little push in the right direction. As the benevolent servant of our wise dad should. The name's Malos. I'm the same as you.
The next couple of minutes won't have seemingly anything to do with Xenoblade, but it is absolutely crucial to really understand the themes the franchise is getting at. So all I am about to cover also applies to Xenogears, Xenosaga and Xenoblade. So while it may seem unrelated at first, all I'm about to talk about will eventually come full circle and reveal the bigger picture behind the core themes of the entire series. In alchemy there exist three base elements: salt, sulfur and mercury. While these may seem random at first, their role becomes much clearer when we look at their chemical reactions with water. Salt mixes with water, sulfur floats on water, mercury sinks beneath water. As water is understood to be the source of life, the alchemical salt is synonymous with the body, while sulfur represents the soul and mercury the spirit. In alchemy, salt is directly associated with the element water, since the two mix into one substance and represents the physical body. Sulfur, on the other hand, is representative of the element fire, which symbolizes the soul, which makes a thing unique. Finally, mercury is connected to the element air, the spirit, which is the intangible link between body and soul. Together, the three elements make up the soul, body and the spirit, and are very similar to the Holy Trinity of the Father, Christ and the Holy Spirit. Or in Xenoblade 2 it would be Ontosaga, Father Fire, Logos, Christ Water, and Pneuma, Holy Spirit Air. Combined, the three elements make up a fourth derivative element, the element of earth, which encapsulates all that exists within the physical universe. Not an individual element, but rather an impure combination of the three primary elements. For example, every apple that exists is of the element earth, as it is a physical object. Yet as there exists more than one apple in the world, each apple has a different element of fire, a different soul that makes it unique from every other apple. Apples and oranges, on the other hand, while both earth, have different water elements as they are two different kinds of fruits. That's basically the idea behind the elements. However, there is an impurity associated with the creation of the fourth element, which is called the caput mortuum, deadhead, and not part of the other elements but an unwanted byproduct in the creation of the fourth element. This idea of impurity removed from the original Trinity served as an explanation for the existence of evil in the world in trying to explain its existence alongside a just God. This impurity, or caput mortuum, deadhead, became associated with Satan and the Gnostic concept of the Demiurge. Hence the search for the Alchemical Magnum Opus, which was less interested in the creation of literal gold but rather a search for spiritual gold, and thus gnosis. The alchemical great work, or magnum's opus, is the idea of breaking the fourth element, earth, down into its three base elements in a process called an negredo, to remove the impure caput mortuum from the earth, or psychologically breaking down and reforming the ego, thus purifying and transmuting it into the fifth element, the quintessence. This purification process is called the albedo. The resulting quintessence is the spiritual gold of the magnum opus, the philosopher's stone, or the rubedo. If you played Xenosaga, you will recognize those names and how intentional these types of references have always been to the stories of the Xeno series. And much like how mercury is chemically used to bind gold and wash it out of the earth, so too was the spiritual Mercury, or Holy Spirit, meant to play a special role in this purification of the body and resulting extraction of the quintessence. The quintessence is reflected in the resurrection of Christ, or the Buddhist rainbow body, the shedding the caput mortuum and being reborn as a pure embodiment of the divine. Thus the concept of resurrection encodes the idea of transcending the spiritual deadhead, shedding the caput mortuum of the earth physical body. This is also reflected in Christ dying for mankind's sins, which in the alchemical sense basically means that sins, or evil, are a consequence of free will in the earthly existence, while God, or the quintessence ether, is pure good, and thus evil is simply a consequence of existence and man's fall from grace after eating from the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. Over time, this idea of the magnum opus became associated with the archetypal story of the hero slaying a dragon and rescuing the princess from the underworld. The image of the winged fire-spewing serpent seems to represent the total potentiality of the human soul, and thus it represents the Negredo of the great work, containing both good and evil. Thus slaying the dragon, and spilling its blood, reflects the idea of releasing the divine spark trapped within the human soul. In alchemy, dragon's blood was sometimes used to refer to mercury sulfide, thus showing the special role of Mercury, or the Holy Spirit, in the quest for gnosis, the metaphorical slaying of a dragon. So within the image of slaying the dragon, we have encoded the Mercury spirit releasing the divine essence from the earth, just like mercury is used to wash out gold from the dirt. Basically, the Demiurge has trapped within it the potential for good, but needs to be born again and purified from the corrupted matter. This final stage, also known as the rubedo, reddening, signifies the end of the alchemical great work. The crystallized blood of the dragon could be seen as representative to the rubedo itself, the crimson-colored philosopher's stone.
The lives created by Zanza and Mayneth inevitably attempt to escape the passage of fate. This signifies the beginning of their destruction. Mayneth accepted this and entrusted the future of this world to you. Many times, your visions have allowed you to change the passage of fate. You saved the lives of those destined to die.
I couldn't save everyone.
Nothing that exists is perfect. It is a sad truth, but you can learn from it and begin the journey on a new path. Not Zanza's path, but one that you forge yourselves.
Our own path.
So, decide, Shulk. Will you walk the path laid out by Zanza, or will you walk a new path? The Monado awaits you.
That was always how it was going to be. If I'd wanted to walk the predetermined path, I wouldn't have come this far. Even with the odds stacked against us, even though I can't see the future, I'll keep walking. My own path, that I decide. Fiora, Rhine, Dunvan, Sharla, Melia, Ricky. We all feel the same.
Well then, you must defy fate to succeed. Succeed, and follow a new path.
Alvis, are you...
You already know. You know what I am, and what you must do.
In Xenoblade 1 we see this in Shulk's resurrection, freeing himself from the influence of Zanza and finding his own Monado. In Xenoblade 2 it is Malus who seeks to liberate himself from Amalthus and achieve free will by finding his own monad, which is embodied by Aeon, as well as Rex's understanding of the dualistic bond between Driver and Blade that awakens him to his Pneuma. Just as Blades and Driver, and Bionus and Alrest are mirror images of one another, so too are their stories reversed fractals, and together the two stories form a whole greater than the sum of its parts, which makes the constant whining of fanboys about which game is better that much more ironic, as it ultimately just makes both games worse in the process, since it's a viewpoint that misses the entire point of the franchise. So let us quickly sum up the whole alchemy stuff so we can finally get to how it relates to Logos and Pneuma. In a sense, the Alchemical Magnum Opus is just allegorical for the idea of soul-searching, of clashing the dualities and trying to find a purified truth but applied on a psychological level. In a sense, it is just a really fancy way to talk about thesis, antithesis and synthesis. All of this alchemy is symbolized through the Rosicrucian rose cross, which represents the 5 elements and their connection to sulfur, mercury, and salt. For Jung, this Alchemical Magnum Opus is just another way to express his own ideas about the trinity of the human consciousness, the ego, superego and the id, for looking into one's own subconsciousness and retrieving a form of spiritual gold, or the Sophia, the Anima, to complete the inner Magnum Opus, which brings us all the way back to the Anima and Animus and their connection to Logos, Pneuma and the collective unconscious of the Unus Mundus as it is portrayed in Xenoblade. Klaus' attempt to use the Condit to evolve mankind to a higher level of existence is based on exactly this principle of the Alchemical Magnum Opus and the strive for gnosis. This connection is much more obvious in Xenogears and Xenosaga, given the original namesake of the Condit is Zohar. Klaus destroying the world with the Condit is also an almost one-to-one retelling of the same event which also happened in Xenosaga's story, while the backstory of the Condit's discovery is a one-to-one retelling taken straight out of Xenogears. So even though it might seem completely unrelated at first, the Xeno series has always been heavily referential to these occult principles, and Xenoblade 2 is no stranger to this as well, although the Blade series is much less in your face about it, which honestly works out for the better, as Xenosaga and Xenogears tend to get overly pretentious at times. Xenoblade gets across the same themes in a much more cohesive fashion, without insisting upon itself. All these alchemical Gnostic principles are then further expanded upon by merging these principles and Jung's concept of archetypes with the entirety of all human belief system to try and create some form of unified worldview, which is called Theosophy, and is the bedrock for all this New Age neo stuff. Theosophy loosely translates to divine wisdom and is the belief of achieving a divine understanding of the nature of the universe and the secret of humanity. At its core lies a synthesis of all human belief systems into a grand unified theory based on a psychological deconstruction of these most ancient archetypes of the collective unconsciousness. You could see it as the theological magnum opus of the Gnostic alchemy, a unified and purified religious belief system born from clashing, fusing and rebirthing the very foundations of humanity. In this interpretation, the monad is broken down into 2 aspects, the buddhi and the atma. Atma refers to the universal divine principle, truth in its absolute form, while buddhi represents humanity's understanding of this universal truth of God, that thing which we call morality. As combination of these 2 principles, the monad represents the true nature of the world which lies beyond our control. Hence Theosophy, or the magnum opus of Gnosticism, strives to understand this divine truth, true morality unclouded by the flawed nature of humanity. However, for everyone that actually thinks about it, it becomes pretty obvious how easily such an ideology could be used to justify unimaginable evils, as by his very nature, the enlightened one claims to be right about everything and thus can justify all wrongdoings as a morality beyond the understanding of others.
Hey, why are you so interested in my finances all of a sudden?
What is up with you, kid? You've been a right gloomy guts lately.
I was thinking about Amalthus. If what Jin said is true, The Praetor doesn't just hate blades, but humans too. I mean, he basically hates the whole world, seems like.
How so?
In old Tornan, humans lived together with blades that eventually became titans. So destroying Tornan was the same as destroying the titans. Amalthus must have known that the titans have been dying off over the last few centuries.
Cannot live without titans! Everybody go bye-bye!
Maybe the Praetorium saw it as an obstacle to their power. If the blades were becoming titans and creating new land, people might have more faith in the blades. If a new faith emerged, it would threaten the Praetorium and its dogma.
I understand that much. That's just war and politics. But
Rex?
hating people, hating yourself, where does it end? What do you do when you hate the whole world?
You mean...
Destroy it. That's all that's left. Tell me I'm wrong.
That's a leap of logic. But I think a lot of mortals are like that.
Do you remember talking to the Praetor? I said it felt like talking to Malos.
Yeah, you did say that.
It's a funny thing. Malos and the Praetor, they want the same thing.
This is why Jen and Amalthus, who are completely morally opposed to one another, ironically want the exact same thing, and why both of them have a third eye on their forehead, which are themselves complete opposite of one another. A complete red core and half a blue core. Both of them claim to act on some higher moral justice, but are actually suicidal psychopathic extremists. That's also what the difference between Platonism and Neoplatonism ultimately boils down to. Platonism believes in the unknowable true forms of things, which boils down to a pre-existing morality beyond the understanding of the individual, while Neoplatonism would reject this notion of true forms, boiling down to a reductionist form of morality. This is where it all connects back to the Xeno series, which always depicts the main characters as Platonic philosopher king figures, who don't claim godhood and truth for themselves, and Demiurge-like enemies, which are power-drunk humans that think they got it all figured out and justify themselves as agents of a divine higher calling, which usually ends up with them abusing the divine principle. The content in its fifth element, the ether, as a battery for man-made god machines. Every Xeno titles is based on rejecting mankind's claim of this divinity. In the series you never defeat or ring a single real god, only the hubris of mankind. By embracing the imperfections of human judgment through an honest clash of personal ideologies which temporarily births a greater synthesis that doesn't belong to any one individual, only existing for a single moment between two people. In other words, the cataclysm between objective and subjective truths is what lies at the very core of this story's conflict, with Rex representing the Platonic philosopher king, someone who has acknowledged the world's imperfections, and the Neoplatonic antagonists that seek gnosis. Just as Shulk also wishes for a world with no gods where everyone can decide their own future and have their own metaphorical monado. This is why Rex's Pneuma, the embodiment of his Jungian anima, is born from his realization that drivers and blades both have their own paths to walk. By him sustaining Pyra after her emotional death, as she once shared her life force to sustain his body, he gains his Pneuma, which awakens the conduit from its slumber. This is also why Rex's true resonance reforms Pyra and Mithra as two distinct beings, as his apotheosis is the rejection of Gnostic unity. The core crystal recognizes the validity of both contradictory sets of data that are the two different personalities Pyra and Mithra, thus reforming as two separate entities. At this point it is probably worth mentioning that, as the developers are Japanese, the work is likely more influenced by Buddhist views on change, stagnation and corruption rather than any Western belief systems, and just uses Platonism, Gnosticism and other esoteric Western stuff as a foreign medium to explore their own ideas, so one shouldn't read too much into why exactly they picked those specific ideas, most likely because it sounds cool and exotic to their culture and fits with the whole expanding your horizon aspect of the story to add a whole bunch of different influences to it. Basically a very fancy way of saying that no one individual should decide for the collective, and how no one position is necessarily more right than another. So people should try to understand one another and find a solution that everyone can live with by clashing their ideals in friendly rivalry. The deeper Platonic influences on the story have already been perfectly summarized in an essay by within.riblifit.com, so I won't bother going into too much detail on the specifics of it since they already line up with everything else I'm going to cover in this video. So if you want to take a deeper dive into that, there is a link to the blog post in the video's description in the pinned comment.
Ontos, Logos, and Pneuma. The three cores of the Trinity processor formed their cornerstone. However, Ontos triggered a space-time transition event and disappeared forever. I was left with the other two, Logos and Pneuma, entrusting them with managing the blades. Malos and Pyra. Those are the names that you now know them under.
So, I am Pneuma.
After the destruction of Earth, Klaus tries to repent by recreating the world and engineering a new cycle of life, featuring not only a self-enclosed cycle to recreate biological matter through the Titans, but also a secondary cycle of blades which tries to quantify the intangible mimetic aspects of humanity, like culture, ideas and philosophy. This solution itself reflects back on Klaus' detached hyper-scientific mindset as he tries to quantify the unquantifiable mental facets of humanity, reducing them to 1s and 0s. While Zanza became a control freak because he deemed his experiment a success, the architect instead became this humbled figure and thought he could redeem himself by becoming the enlightened martyr. Ironically, his world failed exactly because he rejected his past self and those like it from it, thus just repeating the same mistake again by trying to judge those he didn't understand. Like a scientist merely making changes and adjustments based on data gathered from previous experiments. Although not an active force of destruction like Zanza, his inertia paved the way for others to do the job for him. Like a driver's blade, Amalthus became an embodiment of Klaus' shadow, dooming mankind to the same cycle of destruction as Zanza. At the core of this cycle lies the Cloud Sea, the very fabric of existence within Alrest. In Tantal we learn that Titans absorb the Cloud Sea, which lets them generate ether, the quintessence of Alrest. It is not entirely clear whether or not ether is something that has always existed within the Xenoblade universe or if it was created by the Condit itself. However, since the Bioness and the Monado do also control and observe ether, I think the most likely scenario is that the Condit is simply capable of interacting with the fabric of the universe, which is based on the luminiferous ether theory. In Xenosaga, ether is a strange mixture of nanomachines. Given that all matter in Alrest is based on a sort of nanomachine colony, we can assume that the ether as it exists within Alrest, the building block of all life created by Klaus, is manipulated using these machines. So the universal fabric is altered through these artificial nanobots that are powered by the Condit. This explains why blades, which are basically just processing units, can even interact with ether to begin with, and why the Aegis, which is directly tied to the Condit itself, has unlimited power that doesn't come from nearby ether and can rewrite the literal laws of nature. So when Jin says that he can control all elementary particles in the context of Xenoblade, this really means that he can control all local ether particles. In other words, Jin's power is similar to the Aegis. However, unlike Pneuma, who can literally warp reality, he can only alter things that already exist in the world. The difference in their abilities also reflects on the overarching theme of the villain's stagnation, and the hero's ability to change. In a broader sense, Pneuma, The man-made android's body serving as an avatar for the divine power of the conduit is also indicative of Tekken, mankind's channeling of Gnostic wisdom through technology, an avatar for the wisdom goddess Sophia, or man's higher knowledge, in this case a representation of Rex's awakening as master driver.
You don't make sense. Didn't you go to all that trouble to rebuild it? Then why would you...
It is fate.
Fate?
It is fated to happen. It cannot but happen. My atonement was doomed from the start.
That can't be.
I had made my peace with it. Once more, I longed for nothing more than to disappear. However, something has now changed. And that is you, Rex. You and Pneuma.
Me? And Pyra and Mithra?
You reforged your bond in a way I had not thought possible. And the life you share. Moreover, the conduit, which fell into a stubborn silence after the world's end, has begun stirring once more. Rex, the power you and Pneuma exercise is the conduit's power. It comes leaking out of some far-flung dimension. And it is a power we can know nothing about.
A similar idea of humans interacting with ether through the use of nanomachine technology has also been present in Xenosaga, and since Xenoblade 1 is more or less a pocket dimension created by a supercomputer, everything in that world is probably also some weird biological nanomachine nonsense, thus explaining how monado replicas and ether manipulation can still work in that universe even after Alrest disappears. But back to Xenoblade 2, I find it hilarious how the game does something so on the nose that I'm shocked I didn't pick up on it sooner. The game ends with Rex proclaiming that the real Elysium has been here all along. It's funny how this revelation is shoved directly into our faces from the very start of the game. We have always been in Elysium, as the entire story does already take place in a world above the clouds, which is the most obvious imagery for paradise imaginable. It's pretty neat visual storytelling. The entire point of the story is that the world can be either heaven or hell depending on the individual's perspective, and that we don't need to destroy or reject the world because of its flaws, but that paradise is revealed once people accept their personal differences and come together despite of them. The idea that people become greater than the sum of their parts not by abolishing their differences and trying to ascend beyond them, but by coexisting and elevating one another in their own unique ways, passing the torch, or in this case, the flaming sword between them to achieve ever greater heights. Alrest, the world created through this new cycle of life, is structured very similarly to Yggdrasil and the 9 realms of Norse mythology, yet for some reason the Titans are not named after the Norse realms like Muspelheim or Nibelheim, but are instead named after the 7 deadly sins. At least this is the case in the Japanese version of the game, while the English translation only makes very vague references to the deadly sins, like Argentum's name representing greed through its allusion to the Latin word for silver coins. Belphegor, the demon of sloth or indolence, has an interesting link to Amalthus, sloth representing his inertia and unwillingness to change, but on an interesting instance of synchronicity, Belphegor's prime number has encoded in it 130S 666 13-0S, and the mark of the beast's connection to Amalthus is pretty self-explanatory, as he literally has an artificial eye of providence that lets him control the world. Alternatively, the 7 deadly sins could represent the 7 archons, which are astrologically linked with the planets and seen as symbolic gatekeepers that keep humanity trapped within the realm of the Demiurge. Given the Gnostic obsession with good and evil, the 7 deadly sins and 7 virtues could probably somehow be linked to representing the knowledge of good and evil aspect of the 7 archons, which must be conquered to achieve gnosis. So the Titans could also represent the places Rex has to journey through to break through the realm of the Demiurge Amalthus and reach Elysium.
To the Aegis and her driver, we're here to pass on an order from His Eminence. You are to use the Aegis's power to bring down that ship.
Huh?
What's wrong? This is your duty, Pilgrim.
My only duty is to open the way to the World Tree.
You cannot do it? If so, then we must take the Aegis into custody.
I get it now. They just wanted to use Mithra's power to burn up their little problem. Nothing new under the sun.
I didn't say we couldn't do it, but we have to stop Jin. Tell your boss that's what we're doing, okay?
We don't negotiate holy decrees. If you don't comply, then prepare for righteous chastisement.
Interestingly enough, Indel at times refers to Rex's journey as a pilgrimage. As the player is exploring Alrest's different cultures, Rex is also confronted with all aspects of humanity growing throughout his journey, similar to Plato's cave allegory. Rex sets out and becomes aware of the world's true nature, eventually returning as a philosopher king. Although perhaps not immediately apparent, this actually ties directly into Rex himself, so let's take a moment to talk about our protagonist here. While he is obviously not the deepest, most complex character ever created, there is still more going on behind the surface than people give him credit for. Rex's existence as a salvager, and by extension his character, is entirely based around the idea of searching for treasure. When the group first crash lands on Torgith, Rex immediately panics and doesn't know what to do. This reaction takes a sudden and complete turn once he lays eyes on his salvager helmet, and he immediately gathers the resolve to find their missing friends. This seemingly minor moment really ends up telling us everything we need to know about Rex, which is that he knows nothing besides salvaging, and that he was practically raised by salvagers and the codes they live by. This is further empathized by the sound design of the scene itself, which is meant to directly put the player into Rex's mindset. Everything related to the trait serves as a mental and literal physical anchor for him, as it is the only thing he knows. It is not really searching for his friends that helps him take control of the situation, but rather that he finds purpose in the act of searching itself, as this has always been his job. Which is why he immediately nails Van Herm's teachings about toppling obstacles with his anchor shot. His flawed hot-blooded nature is counterbalanced with Pyra's flawed timid and Mithra's highly analytical nature. Just another one of the many ways in which the three are acting as complementaries to one another, having finally found someone that can both literally and figuratively share and heal their wounds. Rex's eagerness or salvager instinct for searching is then once again invoked when he proposes to collect humans' missing ship parts. So this isn't really just a one-and-done type of deal, but a character quirk that it is constantly being reinforced throughout the story in minor ways. In a sense, Rex is exactly the type of person that would do random side quests, not just to help others but because it is in his nature.
Where's Gramps and Nia? We gotta find them! They can't be far!
Okay.
First time Rex's salvager code is interrupted is after his upgrade from salvager to mech pilot, representing his evolution from diving into the below to surfacing to the above. It is the moment he finds the treasure within Pneuma that he both mentally and physically ascends. However, his original code still makes a return before the fight with Melas, and the idea of having a drink with him shows that the code still holds importance to him even if the salvager outfit isn't his whole existence anymore. Rex's second outfit symbolizes the evolution of the old, keeping and evolving elements of the past, without outright rejecting them. Once again embodying the opposite of the antagonists, the potential for change and growth that they rejected in their embrace of stagnation. This is also shown when Rex is about to give up his journey and return to his life as a salvager, saying that it is all he is good for, as it is everything he has ever known. Ironically, it is also within this upbringing where the hero rests, shown by the village's alternative name, and so the true sword of the Aegis is found by diving underneath his own hometown, returning to his roots after losing his way and learning where he went wrong before. Another interesting thing is how the developers made sure to make his origins completely irrelevant to his character. By disconnecting him from not only Litheria but also leaving his true origins unanswered, it is established that neither his heritage nor lack thereof truly matter to his character. Ironically, it is this mystery that makes him truly average. In fact, they went so out of their way to make him as unspecial as possible that Mithra ends up having visions about him and Tornan that all transpire exactly as she sees them. In other words, while chosen through pure causality within the context of the Xenoblade series, Rex is actually so unchosen that he can't even change the future, which is the big meme feature the series has established for itself. Ironically, being shown to Mithra in a vision and having all of those visions about him come true distinguishes Rex from Shulk as someone not existing in this special flux outside of causality that Shulk exists in after being resurrected by Alrest. Funnily enough, the guy who was predestined to save Mithra ends up more generic because it implies that he doesn't have the Monado's super special future-altering abilities, which is further empathized by his and Mithra's usually very limited foresight abilities. On a side note, Mithra's temporarily enhanced vision abilities are likely due to her berserk mode strength and connection to the Condit. This would also explain why Alrest has far superior vision abilities, due to his unique connection with the Condit that was likely established when his core triggered the phase transition event. Furthermore, I find it really interesting that we never really learn if Rex would have even had the aptitude to become a driver without his link to the Aegis, which probably made him circumvent the blade system's regular bonding requirements entirely. Normally, blades only bond with drivers that contain usable data for their psychological growth. However, as Pyra is one of the administrative keys to the entire blade system, all blades should be able to bond with her driver, who shares part of her administrative core, regardless of the driver's actual aptitude.
I just want to save.
Only by the end of his journey does he ever resonate with a core crystal in the natural way, leaving it open to interpretation if he even had the potential prior to this moment, or if perhaps the journey itself is what gave him the ability to become a true driver, which was always the main focus of his character arc. Considering that blades are influenced by their drivers, we could assume that the reason Pyra and Mithra returned as two unique entities is likely also due to Rex's influence on their resonance. Further reflecting on the knowledge of the Philosopher's King, capable of grasping the dualistic nature of the world, the conclusion to his journey is learning to let go of Pyra and Mithra, and accept the changing nature of the world. In a sense, their sacrifice only exists to force Rex to actually live up to the things he said to both Gin and Malos. By being able to move on with his life, he is rewarded with the miracle that Jin was denied. So while Pyra and Mithra's return might seem like a cop-out, it actually serves as a very fairy tale style way of reinforcing the theme of the story, which I personally think suits the more whimsical, Ghibli-esque atmosphere of the story, but that's up for interpretation. Another aspect of his growth is that he refers to Pyra's power as the power to protect, which he doesn't realize stands in completely cognitive dissonance to Pyra and Mithra's own view of their powers, which has so far caused nothing but death and suffering. It is only later, after meeting Adam, that he realizes that he is the one who must find the power to protect her, both physically and emotionally. By blindly thinking Pyra's power was the power to protect, not realizing that she feared becoming a tool of destruction, he was blinded by her divinity, unable to realize her emotional pain, while she shouldered the burden of sustaining his life, healing the physical wounds caused by Jin. Rex didn't realize that his path had to be different, that he had to sustain her life by healing the emotional wounds caused by Malos. Pyra and Mithra state that the sound of their heart has stopped, but there is still something ringing out. That something is the Condit's power being awoken from its slumber through the alchemical interaction between Rex and Pneuma. Rex's naive understanding of Pyra is perfectly encapsulated within the first few minutes of the story. Just like the treasure chest he finds at the very beginning of the game, which he gauges the value of immediately without accessing its proper value, so too starts he out blind to Pyra's emotional struggles. After all, in his own mindset he doesn't get involved with salvaging military supplies, so it never even occurs to him that Pyra might see herself as a weapon. In contrast to this, Amalthus is shown to have salvaged what are likely parts of an artifice which his forebears from Judicium also retrieved from the Cloud Sea. It's just a nice small detail that shows their contrasting personalities. In fact, even Amalthus' delusions are perfectly summarized at the very beginning of the game, with Rex mistaking the bells of Elysium for those of Indol. Due to his salvager upbringing, Rex never learned to focus on his immediate surroundings, instead always charging ahead, looking for the next treasure, without assessing its true value, which usually backfires on him. Similarly, he tends to make sense of the world through the salvager's code that was ingrained on him since his early youth, in a sense not so different from a blade imprinted with their driver's mimetic footprint. Fittingly enough, it is right after Pneuma's awakening that his salvager's code routine becomes first interrupted, visualizing this break from tradition into independency. However, the salvager code still makes one final return at the end of the story, as it was not about abandoning the past but simply to actually engage with it and reassessing its values. Similar in nature to future connected themes of not abandoning and forgetting the past. If Amalthus blindly embraces stagnation, then Rex starts out blindly embracing change, without learning from it or even understanding it. In a sense, he learns to become more selfish and asserting his own input on the flux of the world. While Shulk's journey starts with blind revenge, Rex's journey starts with blind trust, yet both ultimately arrive at the same conclusion, albeit from opposite sides, perfectly fitting the parallel nature and mirrored structure of their two worlds and journeys.
It's quiet today, huh? That bell. I think it was the sound of our heart. Has it stopped? It stopped. But something's still ringing out. Yes. So we have to go now. We've got to be with Rex.
Rule 5 of the salvager code. Always be...
I don't think we need to hear it. Come on, let's go.
Hey! At least let me finish, spoiled sport.
Back to Alrest's allusions to Norse mythology. Obviously, there is the world tree Yggdrasil, which in this story is also a literal manifestation of the Tree of Life. Then there is Ophion, who guards the world tree. Wand mirrors Nidhogger. The second serpent, Jormungandr, which encircles the world, could be represented by the orbital ring itself. The different realms with their different species could be reflected in the different titans, though their number doesn't real match in the Norse mythology. Aspects get really muddled outside of the purely visual inspirations. Moritha, which is obviously reflective of Helium, at the roots of the world tree we find an elevator which is strangely surrounded by water for seemingly no reason. Could be a reference to the fountain that lies at the roots of Yggdrasil, at which Odin hangs himself to gaze into the waters and obtain knowledge of the runes. The parallels between Moritha and Elysium, the ruined remains of the old world which lie at both the top and at the bottom of the world tree, heavily remind me of the occult hermetic principle of as above so below, which basically refers to the idea that both the divine and earthly realms are identical in their underlying laws. We can observe this at work by the similarities between the microcosm and macrocosm, or the individual and the collective. However, the irony at display in this story here is that Elysium, the heavenly realm itself, is in ruin, which matches the corrupted, destructive idea of gnosis on which Amalthus' worldview operates. While I doubt it was intentional, Amalthus and Haze's core crystals, who are deliberately noted as unnatural in nature, take the shape of an up and downwards pointing triangle. The up and down pointing motion being an occult symbol for the as above so below principle, while the natural way in which a core is shared is more uniform and complementary instead of an inverse reflection, once again being symbolic of the duality of things, while the true Elysium is revealed to have been neither above nor below but in the middle, similar to the true relationship between driver and blade in Pyria and Mithra, who separated from the unified above of the conduit which gave birth to their unified below Pneuma. In other words, once they reach the true Elysium, they reject their role as the Sophia figure that descends from the pleroma to give gnosis to mankind. So the world tree itself could be seen as a jab on Gnosticism, fitting as it is masked as this life-giving Yggdrasil, but in reality is just a radioactive heap of scrap metal.
sure is bright.
Yeah, it's right through here. I'm sure of it. We've almost reached Elysium. What is this place?
No.
Can this place really be Elysium? Where's the greenery? The water? Birdsong? There's nothing! Nothing here at all!
What a wretched sight. I have not seen anything like this in all my years on Alrest.
Pyra!
I don't understand. I don't get it. This is not how I remember.
That bell sound must be coming from somewhere. Is someone here?
Over there. Poppy detect one big thing, kind of like building, over that direction. Sound seemed like it come from there.
That building, eh? Then there's no point hanging around here.
Yeah. Only one way to find out. Let's go, Rex.
Alright. It might still be okay. Maybe it's just this bit that's destroyed. There's bound to be something over that way.
The name Ophion, the snake guarding the world tree, is also the name of the snake encircling the mythological world egg, in much the same way that the cracking of the world egg is symbolic of the spiritual evolution of man. So too does Ophion's destruction open the way to the world tree, which initiates Alrest's transformation into the real Elysium. In mythology, Ophion and its counterpart Uranome being the myth or Pyra figure, were cast down by Cronus and Rhea. Cronus obviously being related to the Saturn figure, which would be Melas, while Rhea is the feminine principle embodied by Pneuma. Ophion was defeated by Melas, Cronus, 500 years ago, and then again later by Pneuma's siren, Rhea. Rhea being the daughter of Uranus and Gaia, Klaus and Galia, and while the occult Saturn does already symbolize a sort of chaotic force, it is easily eclipsed by the true absolute chaos of Uranus. In the occult, Uranus is so chaotic that its name is fittingly enough just a butt joke, because that's just how little of a shit it gives about anything. The higher order chaos between Saturn, Melas, and Uranus Klaus is also reflective of Melas being a child of the architect, just as Rhea, or in this case Pneuma, is also a child of the Uranus figure Klaus. Going even deeper than that is Uranus linked to the birth of the Indigo children, and I don't think I have to explain who the idea of blue-colored psychics refers to within the context of Xenoblade 2. It's Amalthus. He's literally blue and has a third eye. While the serpent Ophion encircles the world tree, another dragon lies at its roots, the Tornan Titan at its cracked matrix. I think it's very interesting how the imagery here makes it look like the world tree itself has been born from the dragon's womb. Though this is obviously not the case, it's still a great visual that shows how Alrest exists within the beast's belly, the world controlled by the serpentine nature of Amalthus, which was itself birthed and enabled through the alchemical slaying of the Tornan dragon. So in this we also have encoded the idea of the slaying the dragon, or serpent, and the broken world egg, womb matrix, from which the world tree emerges. While the world tree is not truly born from the Tornan Titan, Alrest itself has been shaped into Alchemical Magnum Opus through this symbolic alchemical process. Torna serves as imagery for the origin of Amalthus world, and for the devourer Nidhugger who is biting the roots of Yggdrasil, which also fits with the Amalthus cycle of destruction, literally gnawing away at the world the architect created. Thus it perfectly shows the hubris of Amalthus' creation and his perverted self-sanctification.
This is the land of Mortha.
First time I've seen it.
Yeah. Would you look at that?
It's nothing to shout about. Just a bunch of ruins.
Malos?
A testament to their hubris.
Their hubris? So, humans lived here?
Alrest will suffer the same fate.
So that's why Jin...
Is it really justified?
What are you saying?
I know why Jin wants to destroy everything. But everything can't mean everything, can it?
You're not there yet. That's okay. You'll understand soon enough. Let's cross that bridge when we come to it, huh?
So blades are born from crystals and titans from blades. The titan, in turn, nurtures life.
And someday, births new core crystals.
Right. That's the life cycle of a blade.
It is the way that the architect ordained for the world.
Old Torna worshipped this cycle.
In Old Torna, we revered the Titans, feared them. It was the sacred foundation of Torna, a nation where humans and blades lived in harmony. But humans couldn't live like that. The battle with Malos marked the end. It wasn't long after you and Adam left Torna. He did it. That worm Amalthus.
The Praetor?
What did he do?
The one who really destroyed this place, it wasn't the Aegis. It was him.
Huh?
Which is pretty ironic considering the glyphs around the world tree are a warning against exactly what Amalthus is doing. These proverbs also call back to the eating of the Gnostic fruit of knowledge of good and evil, which ultimately results in the destruction of mankind. Speaking of which, the architect Klaus and Zanza could be seen as the two pillars of the Tree of Life, Boaz and Jechin, representing the right-hand path and the left-hand path. However, more on that later. For now, let's go back to talking some more about the nature of Alrest.
The crystals bonded with the Cloud Sea's particulate reconstructors and formed the nuclei of new life. Those nuclei developed into minute life forms, the Titans, who would, over time, grow larger and larger. Finally, the Titans gave birth to complex organisms based on the data in their core crystals. This newly birthed life, over untold millennia, evolved into a new breed of mankind.
Alrest's origin, the artificial nuclei of the Cloud Sea, is a mist of nano-machines that break down the remains of the former world into the prima material which serves as the foundation for all existence in Alrest. This is the ether, the quintessence of Alrest, which also makes up the different ether, blade, elements like fire and water. In alchemy, the ether is the fifth element and the philosopher's stone of the Magnum Opus, the godly essence that permeates everything. When the cloud sea disintegrates the remains of Moritha, they take on the same shade of blue particles that can be seen in the summoning of blades in the ether stream at Tantal, confirming that these particles do in fact appear to be ether that is being extracted from the old world to build the new one. This means when a blade is born, the core crystal simply manipulates the nearby ether into a physical shape based on the data contained within the core, explaining the exact mechanics behind their abilities.
Blades come in all shapes and sizes. Some human-shaped, some not.
Some people say the shape depends on the kind of person the driver is.
The resonance between blade and driver is a mysterious thing.
Thus the Cloud Sea is a primordial soup of ether, into which Klaus introduced the core crystals, that were originally created as a replacement for brain cells and contain data about the previous life forms that inhabited Earth, thereby binding the basic physical building blocks, the ether, with the basic cognitive building blocks, the mimetic imprint within the core crystals, to create the nuclei of new life. Thus the evolutionary cycle of the core crystals eventually leads to the rebirth of humanity through the Titans. This represents the collective unconsciousness of humanity which has been recycled from the previous world and thus still holds all the archetypes of the old world within it. Hence all life on Alrest is based on archetypal forms of life from the original Earth. We can see this in every animal in the game, all of which resemble bizarrely mismatched chimeras based on real-life animals. Alrest features a large variety of bizarre gigantic fish monsters which we would normally associate with prehistoric underwater creatures, fitting for a world still caught in the early stages of evolution. Therefore the blades, which are shaped by humanity's subconsciousness, serve as physical embodiments of the collective unconsciousness of humanity, the Annus Mundus, as alluded to earlier, with Dramark, Bright and Pandoria, all sort of serving as embodiments of their drivers' hidden thoughts. The Annus Mundus and the archetypes emerging from it are a concept by Carl Jung, who proposes that all human ideas spring from the same well and are just different emanations of a much larger primordial truth. For example, the fact that completely isolated cultures all end up developing religions with oddly similar beliefs about death and resurrection. In Xenosaga the same idea is expressed through the imaginary number domain of the Annus Mundus driver operation system, UDO, in which human consciousness resides. In Xenoblade 1 it is embodied through the cycle of the Bionus feasting on the souls of its inhabitants. In Xenoblade 2 it is depicted as the blade cycle that transmits humanity's data to the duality of Logos, Pneuma, who in turn relay that information to the architect. From this new cycle of life the first Titans are birthed by the Cloud Sea and go on to give life to a variety of new species based on the data within their cores, similar to how the Bionus and Mechanus gave birth to live in their own image. Eventually these Titans die and become reabsorbed into the Cloud Sea, thus closing the cycle. The secondary evolutionary cycle is that of the blades, which serves to observe and regulate the psychological aspects of humanity. The blades absorb data from the life forms created by the Titans into themselves and evolve over time. After its driver dies, a blade reverts back into its core and the data it collected is sent back to Logos and Pneuma, and by extension to Klaus himself. As blades collect more data they eventually evolve into rare blades and their physical bodies become shaped by the data of their drivers. Eventually the blades return to the Titan that birthed them to be transformed into Titans themselves, thus giving rise to new further evolved life forms based on the accumulated experiences from their time as blades. These Titans then grow new core crystals that will eventually bond with the new life forms created by the Titan. This cycle continuously repeats itself as the newly born blades bond and observe the new life forms their ancestors created. We see this when Van Herm shows the group that the purest core crystals are born from Titans, and are ripe like a fresh steak as he calls them. As they accumulate more raw data, blades eventually begin rejecting drivers with less favorable traits. Traits Klaus associates with his own former self. Since Klaus states that the new mankind isn't any different from the previous one, it also makes sense that the pool of driver potentials is continuously shrinking as Alrest becomes more similar to the state of humanity as it existed during the time of Mortha. This is why Amalthus cleansing the crystals and absorbing their data boosts their resonance rate as they revert back to blank slates, thus becoming more receptive to outside stimuli.
What an incredible place.
It's the matrix of our Titan.
What does...
When the time comes, this is where blades come to be reborn as Titans.
You mean we'll all become Titans someday?
It's nice to be here again. After 800 years.
Were you born here too, Azurda?
After all, I was a blade born from the Tornan Titan. Of course, I don't have any memories of that time. Once a blade becomes a Titan, they can live without being bound to the driver who awoke them. One day, they may come to watch over their children as the very ground beneath their feet.
And the fleeting bonds become eternal. It's the basis of the Tornan Creed.
Eternal bonds.
However, this cleansing ritual has the unfortunate side effect of halting the creation of new Titans, as the blades can no longer obtain the data necessary for their evolutionary transformation into Titans. As previously mentioned, Amalthus is thus not only gnawing away at the literal tree of life but also at the metaphysical occult tree of life, as he literally devours the physical manifestation of mankind's collective unconsciousness, thus removing mankind from divinity, or Elysium, by causing the stagnation of the metaphorical annus mundus, which in turn affects the psyche of the individual, as they find themselves in a world of both mental and physical decay. To put it more simply, the dragon titan of Tornan, the imagery of the world tree springing from its womb, serves as a physical representation of Amalthus' alchemical magnum opus. The slaying of the dragon, or the spilling of the dragon's blood, which is associated with the rubedo and philosopher's stone, represents the stagnant world created by Amalthus, the world in which he eats the divine and entraps humanity. That was kickstarted with his destruction of the Tornan greed. In other words, that the pursuit of gnosis itself is what leads to the creation of the Demiurge, who is not a false god but the inflated ego of man made manifest. This is incredibly fitting, considering that by Amalthus enacting what he believes to be the archetypes, he actually ends up becoming another Zanza figure. Ironically, by becoming a physical embodiment of the suppressed desires of Klaus, and thus those of his other half Zanza, Amalthus ends up being Klaus' symbolical blade, an avatar tainted by his hidden desires, that was enabled by Klaus' own inactions. So it's very ironic that Amalthus' final form, a Blade Eater, that devoured the entirety of Klaus' blade system, has himself become more blade than human. Continuing this thought, Malas, the one possessed by the spirit of this world's version of Zanza, would be this game's version of Shulk, the Monado boy possessed by an evil spirit going on a quest to kill the false god and gain his own self-actualization.
If the architect did send blades down to this world, it was for my sake. To find and raise cores containing more powerful, wondrous, unparalleled data. That is why I created the cleansing procedure. Behold the culmination of my work!
You lunatic. He took the cores from all those blades. So that was the reason for the cleansing.
I am an agent of the architect's will.
What is he saying?
Delusions of grandeur.
You can't just decide stuff like that, dude! You're out of your damn mind!
It is no delusion. Have you forgotten the Aegis's power? That power. Is it not the Aegis's power to erase worthless things from existence? Is that not the architect's very will?
In Greek mythology, the Titans are the progenitors of the Olympians and the children of the primordial deities Uranus Sky and Gaia Gaia, Earth. In Xenoblade 2, these are represented by Klaus and Galia. The archetype Klaus represents the Uranus figure, father to the leader of the Titans, Cronus. Cronus, who is tied to Saturn, and the Demiurge can himself be linked to Defying and the Bionus and Zanza, with both of whom Klaus shares a somewhat fatherly bond, similar to the bond between Uranus and Cronus. Klaus is the creator of the Trinity processor, which in turn created Ion. And similarly, he is also the originally entity from which Zanza and the Bionus were born. In other words, Klaus' connection to these lesser deities and the Titans is likely inspired by the Greek mythology surrounding Uranus, Gaia, and the Titans, which is itself similar to the Gnostic monad and Demiurge archetypes, which have influenced the totality of the series. Galia, on the other hand, who is likely connected to the infernal Guldo, would thus serve a role similar to Gaia. After all, her transformation and demise is what ultimately led Klaus to the creation of Titans, which are the literal or the new humanity walks upon. In the Japanese dub, Galia's name is actually Galatea, which refers to the Greek mythos of the statue carved by Pygmalion. While the name doesn't really make a lot of sense at this point in time, the myth of Galatea shares some strong similarities with the creation of Alhaim van Houten and the Xenogears concept of the contact and antitype. Going even further down that rabbit hole, perhaps the name Galatea is a hint that Galia is partially cybernetic in nature or has some other android attributes to her. We know that the core crystals were created as replacements for human brain cells, so could Galia have been augmented with core crystal prior to the events surrounding Klaus' experiment? Looking back at it, Klaus' experiment is itself highly referential to similar events which occurred in Xenosaga, in particular the experiments of Grimoire Varam, who caused the destruction of Earth in the Xenosaga timeline due to his experiments with the Zohar, which also caused his daughter Nephilim to become an entity of the imaginary number domain. Nephilim was chosen for the Zohar experiments due to her particularly unique brainwave patterns which allowed her to function as a medium for the Zohar. If we extrapolate the idea over into Xenoblade, we see some interesting similarities between the two, namely the unique brainwave patterns required to communicate with the Zohar. Core crystals of the Condit's Trinity processor, which are themselves created to emulate human brain cells. If Klaus serves a role similar to that of Grimoire Varam, then Galia would be the Nephilim XP of the scenario. This would make it extremely likely that Galia's brain patterns could have been augmented with core crystal technology as a part of the conduit contact experiments. If Monolith is trying to recreate their original plans for the story of the Xeno series. If this is true, and Galia was already something akin to an android before the start of Klaus' experiment, it would make sense for her Titan form to resemble a machine, and her transformation into the infernal Guldo would not have been caused by any core crystal abuse that has taken place after the destruction of Earth, but rather because her body already contained core crystals prior to the failed experiment, meaning the expulsion of the Condit's power basically caused her to undergo a mutation similar to that of the Hyenchia's reaction to concentrated ether energy. This sacrifice would also fit into her thematic role as the Gaia figure within the game's allusions to Greek mythology. Galia's name in the Japanese version of the game is Galatea, referring to the stone statue of Greek mythology that was given live through the love of its creator Pygmalion. Longtime fans of the series can probably see this myth's similarities to the creation of Alhaim in Xenogears. Her potential android nature could explain this namesake as the artificial creation Klaus fell in love with over the course of his scientific craft. What makes Klaus even more interesting is the connection between Cronus and Saturn, both of which are associated with the Demiurge. As Cronus represents circular time, the occult associates him with the destructive Ouroboros and the Demiurge, while Uranus represents the primal monad, and Gaia would be associated with the Sophia archetype. In this sense, we could say that Uranus, or rather the architect version of Klaus, represent the divine spark, or the Jungian superego which the ego, Klaus, had been transmuted into, through the activation of the conduit in this misguided alchemical magnum opus for gnosis. Thus the remaining Saturnian lead, the corrupted caput mortuum, was separated from the ego and took the form of the Demiurge Zanza, the embodiment of the Jungian id. The way in Klaus and Galia perfectly encapsulate the core theme of the series is why I believe it is highly likely that they will be the protagonists if the series continues following this timeline. Xenoblade 1 and 2 established the two extremes of Klaus' psyche, so it would only make sense if the next game follows a memory-wiped reincarnation of Klaus that has to come to terms with his past and find his true personality. It would fit with the whole Xenogears Xenosaga rebuild that the series is hinting at, with the Fog King Gnosis stuff of Klaus, Galia, and Elvis end up becoming the new Fae, Ellie, and Wave existence respectively.
Trinity processes synchrate at 96%. That should be good enough. Let's begin the experiment.
Too dangerous.
Ridiculous. It's perfectly safe. We are about to bear witness to the birth of a universe. Once, only a god could perform such a miracle. But today, mankind moves one step closer to the divine.
Are you serious? Do you even fully understand that thing?
What's the alternative? Do you want to just surrender this place to them? The conduit is a gift from some divine entity. It is a gateway. A gateway that will take us to an entirely new world.
You're delusional. Divine entity? The conduit is nothing more than a meta-universe manifold.
Galea, we humans are fools. We've ravaged the planet. We are on the verge of burning even the skies above. Conduit could transform us into something so much more. This is the birth of a brand new universe.
Stop, Klaus!
Similarly, Pyra represents the shadow or eye to Mithra's ego and Pneuma's superego, possessing all the traits that Mithra herself is lacking, though less chaotic than in the case of Klaus and Zanza. This also explains why Pyra's color scheme is representative of Xenogears' Well-12ID, which is the Mech's alternative form when controlled by phase-split personality simply named Id, while the titular Xenogears is reflective of Pneuman, represents the fusion of Fae's fractured psyche, while Pneuma represents Rex's embrace of duality. These Oedipus complex undertones are just a reflection of the female aspect of duality, purifying the male part of duality, and their symbolic roles within the Alchemical Magnum Opus. The female aspect, the mother, is further subdivided into the lover and the whore, the White Lady Mary and the Red Lady, Lilith, and serves as the transformative force of the Magnum Opus, while the male element is the thing which is being transformed by this process. So the duality of the male aspect is the change the male part goes through from beginning to end of the relationship. In Xenoblade, see the core idea of this process in Klaus, who became the architect after the trauma caused by losing Galia and destroying the world. The Lilith archetype is the flame which burns down the male aspect into the Negrito, while the Mary archetype extracts the light from within and transmutes it into the Rubedo. Similarly, Rex is reborn by the Fireblade Pyra and then becomes the master driver after accepting both her and Mithra, which grants him access to the ether of the conduit as he awakens his subconscious shadow, the highest form of the Anima archetype, Sophia, which is then given a physical manifestation through the evolved form of Pneuma, and his heavenly space gear replaces his earthly diver gear. So really the Oedipus complex is just a way to express the core idea of the alchemical process through the lens of Jungian psychology. Basically a guy being attracted to big milkers, Lilith whore, and then eventually settling down once she becomes a mommy GF, Mary mother, being similar in concept to purifying the earth and extracting the alchemical gold from within it. It's like the stereotype of women only wanting the bad boy instead of the nice guy because they want to fix him. In the Jungian sense, female in the context of this Oedipus allegory really just refers to the subconscious part of the personality, because it is based on a male point of view. You could just replace Anima with Animus for the other side of the coin. Xenogears and Xenoblade rely on the Oedipus allegory, while Xenosaga explores the same concept from a female point of view with the relationship triangle between Sachian, Kevin and Alan, which makes Cosmos separate from Mary and stops Zarathustra.
What is this?
Similarly, Laura's subconsciousness also gave birth to Haze and Jin, a blade that can control other blades which become subverted by Amalthus, and Jin, who is the complete mirror image of Amalthus. Laura's role within the story is that of the Adam Cadman, the blueprint of humanity, as her subconsciousness is split into the two extremes of the male and female archetypes, while she also serves as the progenitor of the unique blade and driver fighting style, which is the truest representation of their duality and power. Not only does Laura serve as a progenitor to the true unity between drivers and blades through her discovery of the unique blade-passing fighting style that would become commonplace in the next 500 years, but the embodiments of her subconscious psyche also takes on the highest forms of both the Anima and Animus, the female principle embodied through Haze and the male principle embodied through Jin. Not only does Jin's design feature a third eye, showing his spiritual aspects, but his love for his mother figure is likely also influenced by Laura's own desire to be with her own mother, which ultimately leads him to cling to her life and become a flesh-eater, a perversion of the inherent duality implied by the very nature of her male and female blades. But it is this childlike nature which is identical to Amalthus' backstory and which led him down that very same path. So while Jin is originally a Christ-like figure, the unification of the opposites leads to the creation of the Antichrist or Demiurge figure, which is the tortured soul of the flesh-eater Jin. The procreation with oneself, a blade fusing with their driver, also mirrors the creation of a Demiurge, in that the divine feminine tried to procreate with itself to mimic the true divinity of the monad, and in so doing created the fallen Antichrist figure that is the Demiurge. Haze, on the other hand, serves as the female principle, the wisdom goddess, and the Sophia archetype, which was likely born from Laura's reverence for her own mother, which later found its way into Amalthus' hands and created the exact same, yet also complete opposite outcome to Jin's fusion with Laura. One a flesh-eater with a fully red core on his forehead that wishes for complete chaos, the other a blade-eater with half a blue core on his forehead that wishes for complete order. Both cores originate from Laura's resonance, and are now embodying a perversion of the blade system Laura herself was crucial in revolutionizing, by finding power and embracing the differences between driver and blade, which both Jin and Amalthus now use as justification to demonize the other side. Laura's own arc revolves around the purification of her mother's spirit, through the slaying of the Chimera, the man-machine hybrid created by Amalthus, and the Chaos Star figure Stanif, but more on that later. This act itself, of Laura slaying the corrupted hybrid, is symbolic of the true higher self rejecting this false ideal of gnosis.
Think you're gonna die quick? Now, I'm gonna enjoy watching you suffer!
I will not let you insult my mother like that!
Hurts to hear the truth, don't it?
You think you can pass judgment on my mother? You don't know us!
Leave it, Laura. Trying to talk to him is a waste of time.
He's right. No more mercy. This creature is beyond help.
Jin. Haze. You're right. I won't waste my mercy on him. But I will end his pain.
Excellent! I'll have me some prime-time entertainment with you, girl! Hope you're a screamer, Laura!
This is why Rex letting go of Pneuma is the culmination of the entire story, as he learns to let go where Jin couldn't. thematically mirroring Laura's role as Adam Cadman, which is represented in her defeat Ringavurgord and the freeing of her mother's spirit by moving on from the past. Of course, killing an insane monster is much easier than what the other characters have to do, but it still serves the same thematic purpose. So Laura's role is that of the Adam Cadman, the blueprint of humanity, and the origin of the two principles. The physical Adam Cadman is then later embodied in the form of the philosopher King Rex, who came to rediscover the true nature of drivers and blades and can thus help Jin overcome his pain, thus making everything come full circle. In this context, it is very interesting how many character traits the members of Laura's group share with the members of Rex's group. For example, how Hugo's technological knowledge is present within Torah and his sense of duty within Morag. So while they share similar traits, these traits have become heavily remixed and switched around over the course of 500 years. I think that's just a small nod to the Annus Mundus and the cyclical reappearance of archetypes, or simply the story's overall theme of change. Rex and Meles are to Jin the person standing by in his efforts after Laura is gone. A cycle of change that can heal the wounds of the past, knowing that both good and bad times exist, but in a blade's lifetime everything will repeat itself eventually. The tragic irony is that without even realizing it, Jin has already proven himself wrong the moment he first formed a bond with Meles.
That power comes from the Architect. Why do you wield it for mortal's sake?
To get to Elysium!
And then what? Open it up to humans? Share it out between them?
Do you even need to ask? Obviously!
And then what? Can't you see where that leads?
What are you saying?
Humans will make Elysium into another Moritha. Just as they did with Torna 500 years ago.
I won't let that happen!
And after you die, what then? Who will stop the inevitable?
Isn't that the reason that you blades exist? And when I'm not around to stand by you in that effort, someone else will!
Words can be a curse. This statement summarizes one of the major driving forces within the game. Whether good or bad, all major characters within Xenoblade are guided by the influences of others. Jin is driven by Laura, Amalthus is driven by the Architect, and Rex is driven by the promise he made to Pyra. This theme is also reflected in the very nature of the setting, a divided world with nothing but an ethereal hazy mist connecting the different entities within it. The structure of the setting itself invokes Klaus' speech about parallel universes. This does not only concern the Cloud Sea and the Titans within it, but also the way each character interprets these outside stimuli, leading not only to a personal war on the level of the individual, but also to conflicts on the collective interpersonal scale through the ever-present threat of all-out war between the different Titan nations. Whether it is an external crisis or an internal struggle, in this story everyone is fighting their own war. This is where the true depth of many characters within this tale lies. Even if many of them are rather basic at first glance, what really makes these characters shine is not their destination, nor the complexity and scale of their ambitions, but the very relatable nature of how they got to the point we meet them at. As Meles puts it, the cursed words that drive each person's war, just like the Cloud Sea, only reveals its riches to those willing to go beneath its surface. So too must we read between the lines and look beneath their external masks to get the most out of these characters. This willingness to dive into the unknown, between the different characters' personal truths, is perfectly reflected in Rex's nature as a salvager, one willing to explore the depths between to find a way to Elysium.
You know, you find all sorts of things digging through salvage. Some of it trash, some of it treasure, but all of it from people long gone. Have you noticed how there's fewer Titans each day? I saw one go under just the other day. It was a pretty big one. There must have been loads of animals still living on it. Living space is running out, day by day. And sooner or later, we'll be the ones sinking down into the Cloud Sea. But up there, Elysium is waiting for us.
Seriously, kid? Elysium? Don't tell me you believe that gaff.
So that's, why you're a salvager?
It's just a lie for children. And that there is just an overgrown shrub.
If there's a way to get up there, maybe it's hidden below the clouds. Is it really that crazy?
Seriously, though?
There'd be no need to fight over dwindling land and resources. No need to worry about our homes sinking away. Everyone could have peace and security. I mean, a dream like that, isn't that worth believing in?
Nobody can tell you what to believe, but... everyone, huh?
What?
I always thought people were pretty selfish by nature, but you...
Huh.
Do you have parents?
No. When I asked Gramps, he told me they died when I was just a kid.
Gramps? Oh, the same one who taught you to use arts.
Yeah. He basically raised me himself. He's not like us, though.
Not like... I'm not sure I catch your drift. But this Gramps of yours sounds alright.
Oh.
And you're alright too, kid. Not that different from me.